Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I explore the adventures of fictional super spy James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today we're talking about an extremely significant element of the James Bond franchise, and that is the music of James Bond, the sound of James Bond. It is instantly recognizable. It is an essential element of not just the James Bond franchise, but of spy cinema on the whole. The sound that was created, especially by John Barry in the 1960s, defined the character and expanded the emotional range of what that character's adventures represented. It's hard to emphasize just how significant John Barry's contributions are to the popularity of James Bond today. It's a bit like discussing John Williams and his contributions to Star Wars. The sound of Star Wars defined Star Wars. It's very likely that Star Wars without John Williams would not be the mega phenomenon that it is today. Similarly, with James Bond, without the very particular sound that John Barry developed, building off of Monty Norman's core melodic theme for James Bond, we may not be talking about James Bond today. I think that's a strong statement, but I think it's very true. The sound of this series, the particular signature sound, is so distinctive, is such a signature effect, and deepens the experience of these movies. And that's why I want to dedicate a whole video to talking about it, because the sound has evolved over time, but it has grounded the character, it has grounded the franchise as a whole, and it's as essential to the film franchise as James Bond's Dinner Jacket and Martinis. We've seen what happens when you take the sound out of James Bond. A good example of this would be the unofficial Bond film, Never Say Never Again, created by Kevin McClory as a rival film to the standard Bond franchise. It couldn't use the James Bond theme, and it also didn't use John Barry, and the sound of it is just so alien to the Bond sound that it's almost jarring. If you watch video mashups online of Never Say Never Again footage with, classic John Barry scoring, suddenly Never Say Never Again starts to feel much more like a proper Bond film. What does that mean? Well, that just means that sound is just so significant to what we expect from a Bond movie. So let's start at the beginning. Dr. No, as a film score, introduced the James Bond theme, and that is best understood as a collaboration between Monty Norman and John Barry. Monty Norman had created the original melody, and John Barry arranged it and became the default series composer up until the Brosnan years. That theme is so dramatic and striking. It is aggressive. It is menacing, and it also has a swing to it. So the John Barry sound is very much the sound of a jazz orchestra, especially in the 1960s. The James Bond theme is very much a song that is designed to be played by a fairly intimately sized orchestra of jazz musicians, playing with that sort of like in-the-moment swing. And you feel that on the original recording of the James Bond theme that plays so prominently throughout Dr. No. That it's really never been equaled. The original recording of the James Bond theme is the one that just has the most bite, has the most swing, and part of that is just the intimacy of the size of the orchestra. One thing that has been lost about the James Bond sound as it's gone on and evolved, and this was a change that John Barry oversaw himself, is that it moved from this sort of jazz orchestra sound to a much more symphonic grandeur. And something's been lost in the process. You'll notice that the 1960s John Barry scores in particular, especially scores like Goldfinger and Thunderball, derive a great deal of their energy from the relative intimacy of the orchestra. It's not an orchestra on the same size of what you get in the David Arnold scores. The David Arnold's film scores tend to be very symphonic, very elaborately orchestrated. They are deriving a lot of their energy from the full sound of a large orchestra. John Barry's instrumentation, especially in those early scores, is keyed into a very small orchestra, a small ensemble, tight and in sync. And what that gives is every single instrument, every single player in that orchestra gets the ability to really contribute to the sound. Just a single horn has such crisp clarity on the audio track that it gives it a lot of bite, especially with John Barry leaning so much on these sort of angular jazz chords that are very percussive. I mean, the classic example of that is just like the opening crash of the Bond theme, that like ba-dun-dun. That sort of like blast never feels sharper than when it's done with a small intimate orchestra. It's actually somewhat lost something over time as the orchestra has gotten larger, because the angular harmonies don't quite hit as sharply as they do with that intimate jazz ensemble. And similarly, you lose something about the kind of relaxed jazz orchestra rhythm of the Bond theme. The Bond theme used in those early years, especially in the first two movies, is not a action anthem, and I think this is also something that's been lost about the Bond theme over time. It's a theme that describes Bond in his everyday existence. Think of how the theme starts to kick in when Bond is at the casino in Dr. No and gives his famous introduction. This is, one of a handful of perfect quote-unquote scenes in the series. The Bond theme just kind of kicks in, and it's just an embodiment of Bond as a person existing in the world. It's not celebrating Bond doing something amazing. It's just kind of expressing the way he carries himself in the world. It's almost like keeping time to the way Connery moves, his panther-like gait, as has sometimes been described. It's a truly amazing theme song, and it can't be understated just how essential it has been to establishing the character as an icon. That is one of a handful of instantly recognizable theme songs that, stands up there with the best of the best. And it's not just jazzy, because there were plenty of great jazz anthems from the time that didn't enter the cultural lexicon the way the James Bond theme did. Things like Henry Mancini's Peter Gunn theme, or, even the Lalo Schifrin Mission Impossible theme, which is almost as recognizable as the Bond theme. The Bond theme has a sort of aggressive sense of danger and a very dramatic mood shift, from the way it's going through the guitar line to the chorus of the da 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 that sort of leap into that sort of the swing of that chorus section is really exciting and dynamic, and there's really just not another theme that has ever had that same energy. It's almost irreproducible. Like, you can't reproduce it. And I think the theme unto itself is very significant to understand as part of the sound of the character. That is like the bedrock on which the Bond sound is based. But John Barry's sound for Bond is more expansive than that. What John Barry brought to Bond was not just the sound of a jazz musician, but a sort of lyrical poetry. And in a way, he's picking up from Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming's novels are obviously pulp adventures. They're about violence and dangerous situations, and, you know, Fleming even described them as being, you know, like, essentially glamorous vacation reads for people. They were never intended to be high literature, but they have broad emotional range, and you can sometimes feel Ian Fleming grasping for a broader sense of emotional resonance, especially in novels like You Only Live Twice, which ends on this very melancholy note. The ending of You Only Live Twice is one of the more beautiful things that Ian Fleming ever wrote as an author. And it kind of shifts from this sort of pulpy adventure to this almost existential resonance. And John Barry has this talent for shifting from dramatic excitement. Some of the great cues, you know, we celebrate John Barry for, like the On Her Majesty's Secret Service theme, or the He's Dangerous track from A View to a Kill, these sort of march-like action cues that recur through his movies that are very exciting, very dynamic. He has this capacity for emphasizing, even when it's not really there in the script or the actions in the screen, this sort of poetic grandeur. There are a few examples of this that I could point to, but some of the best are to point to just because they're bringing something that isn't already there, is in Moonraker, because Moonraker is such a light, silly movie, but John Barry's score for Moonraker is really one of his best. And Moonraker is where he truly introduces a full-on symphonic sound for Bond. The sound of the movies he's done before that are much more rooted in John Barry's jazz experience. They're tighter, they're a little bit jazzier. You know, you get this him playing with like this more symphonic sweep in You Only Live Twice and On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and then he's shifting into a slightly more symphonic sound with The Man with the Golden Gun. But Moonraker is really the big statement John Barry gets to make with grandeur. And there are two moments in that movie that always stand out to me musically in terms of showcasing how the Bond sound adds a level of gravitas to these movies that they otherwise wouldn't have. And one is when Corinne Dufour is being executed by Drax for her betrayal, for assisting Bond, and she's being chased by dogs. And this is a very strange sequence in general. It's almost like a sequence from an Italian horror movie. But John Barry's score tips into this very sort of lyrical, driving refrain as Corinne Dufour is running through the woods, being chased by dogs, and dies. It's a fairly brutal scene in a fairly lightweight comedic movie. It's almost like a nightmarish bit, and John Barry is giving this scene so much poetic power, and it's really something else. I think you you don't know what you got till it's gone sometimes, and it's interesting to compare a sequence like that from Moonraker and just how much weight that scene has because of John Barry's music and some of the other scenes that show up in some of the Bond films that John Barry didn't score, and they lack that same sort of weight. And what that says about the John Barry James Bond sound is that there's this register of existential weight that his music brings to the proceedings, even when they're as light and frivolous as Moonraker. There's this shading of emotional depth to it that is expanding the spectacle in a way. Moonraker is a movie that is all about spectacle, and John Barry's score is adding registers of resonance on top of that. Another example from Moonraker, the same movie, is the gorgeous Flight into Space track that he writes with chorus and these dark horns that are signaling Hugo Drax's ascension. It's genuinely poetic and resonant, and you that's a great example from Moonraker, just because that's such a frivolous movie on the whole, but it starts to achieve this real sense of like, this is real spectacle, because it's not just visual grandeur, it's not just special effects work, but there is real emotional depth in what John Barry is bringing to it. And you see that same thing in, You Only Live Twice, with the capsule in space theme that is so instantly striking and hypnotic and strange that it gives moments like the opening of You Only Live Twice, where the astronaut just kind of like drifts off into space, this sort of haunting feeling. There's this sense in which John Barry's Bond sound gives death weight in these movies. It doesn't feel arbitrary. Like there's some real sting to it, and it's not sting that would be there necessarily if John Barry wasn't there to dig into the images that are unfolding on screen and add his magic to it. And so what that tells us about the Bond sound is that the Bond sound is not just there to reinforce what's there on screen, but it's to add another layer to it. The very glamour, grandeur, and sort of spectacular heft of the series is in large part due to its musical sound. And it is a combination of that sort of jazzy, driving swing, and the sort of coolness that comes with that, and the sort of like symphonic heft that John Barry increasingly adds onto the series. So you get both spectacle, operatic weight with this sort of driving energy. Now, John Barry has not scored all of the Bond films. He dropped out for Live and Let Die and The Spy Who Loved Me and For Your Eyes Only, and then subsequently License to Kill. And those films are interesting as experiments in how the Bond sound can be stretched and shaped. Live and Let Die is actually one of my favorite Bond scores. I really love Live and Let Die. And it's interesting how Live and Let Die is playing with that jazz influence, but is also bringing in 1970s funk into it a little bit. It's definitely of its time, but it still feels like it has the sweep and spirit of Bond, even though it's a little bit more tied into the era than some of John Barry's stuff. I don't think that the scores for The Spy Who Loved Me and For Your Eyes Only have aged quite as well. They have their charms as of their period, but one of the, personally speaking, issues I've always had with For Your Eyes Only is that it feels like it's missing something of the Bond sound to that. It's so heavy on its disco influences, and I've come to appreciate that over time. But the Bond sound and its sort of like poetic resonance is somewhat missing from that because it's just so clued into disco. And you see that in some of the action scenes in For Your Eyes Only, where Bill Conti's score is just so like disco exuberant, and it's fun and I enjoy it, but it lacks the thrust of something like the really incredible action cues that John Barry would write. A great example too is like the sort of like Necros attacks, in-flight fight cues from The Living Daylights, both from the opening attack at the MI6 safe house where Koskov is kept, and then the fight on the plane at the end. That's such an arresting, driving, dangerous melody. It's so good that it's like it's better than the movie deserves. And I like The Living Daylights, but John Barry's cue for that is it's really one of the best action cues of all time. It's so instantly exciting when you hear it. And something like the very like jaunty disco tracks of For Your Eyes Only almost trivialize the action in a way that John Barry would never deign to do. You know, and there's much that could be said about, you know, the particular sound that, you know, Michael Kamen brings to License to Kill, or Marvin Hamlisch brings to The Spy Who Loved Me. And, you know, I actually, you know, they have their admirable facets, but we should talk about David Arnold, because David Arnold's sound ended up defining Bond for Brosnan, and in many ways it set the template for Craig's Bond before Thomas Newman and Hans Zimmer really added their contributions. David Arnold's sound begins in Tomorrow Never Dies as an homage to the more symphonic aspects of John Barry. It's interesting to track with John Barry that he leaves behind the sort of jazzy sound of the 1960s, in part because it probably would have felt dated in the 70s and 80s. You know, there's a sense in which the things that feel most dated in the moment are the things that are closest in the rearview mirror. I think the jazzy sound of the 1960s still feels very modern right now, but I'm sure at the time John Barry was a little reticent to lean too much into that because it was so strongly associated with the 1960s. And the Bond theme, you notice John Barry moves away from using the guitar to even just do the classic driving motif of the Bond theme. It moves to that strings doing it. So strings start to do the da 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 thing, especially during the Roger Moore era, and it gives it a much more like sort of like stiff ass Brit kind of quality to it. And that sort of template that John Barry goes in, the symphonic sound that he developed, especially by Living Daylights, really informs where David Arnold built his sound in Tomorrow Never Dies. David Arnold is obviously coming off of the score for GoldenEye, where Eric Serra had experimented with the Bond sound. Now, I like the score for GoldenEye a great deal. I think actually what that score does pretty well is there's a bit of jazziness to it that is not entirely successful. I'll say that, but it captures what I like about John Barry's score, is like that sort of like layers of unexpected poetic depth. One of the cues, for example, that I think is absolutely gorgeous in GoldenEye is the cue for the Monaco casino, where Bond is there with meeting Xenia Onatopp for the first time. And it's just very lyrical and beautiful and lush. And it's adding this sort of rich texture to it that feels very much in line with what John Barry often achieved with his film scores. This like unexpected layer of emotional richness that ordinarily wouldn't be there. It's not necessarily suggested by the material. And I think it does that very well. But it is a big departure from the Bond sound. There was very much a clear, like, this is a sound for the 1990s that GoldenEye is looking for. Tomorrow Never Dies is David Arnold looking back at the John Barry scores, drawing on that orchestral sound, and then introducing some of David Arnold's own influences. There's a lot of, especially in Tomorrow Never Dies, this sort of Jerry Goldsmith influence. And if you aren't familiar with the film scores of Jerry Goldsmith, he did Star Trek The Motion Picture, he did Chinatown, he's very rich and lush and heavy on the brass. And David Arnold's theme for Stargate, for example, feels very Jerry Goldsmith. And so when David Arnold comes in to do Tomorrow Never Dies, it is almost like this big bombastic synthesis between John Barry and Jerry Goldsmith. And it is so dramatic and forceful that I admire it even now. Tomorrow Never Dies is a soundtrack that is trying to be the most Bond that any soundtrack could be. Like, it is going, like the Spinal Tap joke, these goes to 11. It goes to 11 with the Bond factor. And you have to admire David Arnold for doing that. He kind of leaves it all on the table in Tomorrow Never Dies. And David Arnold then becomes the de facto Bond composer. The World Is Not Enough, I think, is a much more sophisticated and underrated score than Tomorrow Never Dies. It takes those same influences, but there's a lot more nuance and diversity in the textures that David Arnold was creating there, and I think it's particularly lovely. I think David Arnold really does a nice job, especially in Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough, of leaning into these sort of melancholy of the love themes that sometimes showed up in the Bond themes of the past. And you get these, he leans into it, especially with the tinge of 1990s melodrama that the Brosnan movies leave it into, these sort of almost weepy love themes, like for Paris and Bond and Electra's theme. They're very sort of emotional in a way that John Barry almost wouldn't have gone for, but gives it these movies that sort of grandeur and sweep that they really should have. And you got to give David Arnold credit for that. Arnold has his weaknesses as much as anybody. He ends up leaning into the excesses of electronics a little bit, especially in Die Another Day, which is a score that is much like the movie. It accompanies bombast over subtlety, right? But there's a beauty in that sort of symphonic grandeur that is created over the Brosnan movies. I think something is lost, and I think the Craig movies end up recalibrating slightly around this, is that what ends up getting lost is the sort of this sort of jazzy driving edge of Bond music, that sort of sense of danger, that sense of distortion in that sort of angular sound that was introduced in the 1960s when you had a smaller, intimate ensemble. The David Arnold sound is huge. And sometimes it works really well. I actually think one of the better presentations of the Bond theme in the entire series occurs in The World Is Not Enough during the boat chase, where David Arnold's cue, and it's not fully presented in the film, but if you listen to the soundtrack, you can hear it, where Bond is in the Q boat, and it's kind of like he's building out. I think that version of the theme is one of the best full orchestra versions of the Bond theme that's been presented to the screen. But in general, something gets lost about the Bond theme when you present it on such a large scale. It really is meant to be performed as a tighter ensemble, because the instruments, the musicians just can't play off of each other with the same crackle of energy when you're on that sort of large scale. It's something that you have to really feel in an intimate group. And so David Arnold's sound kind of pulls in a little bit. Casino Royale is kind of a transitional period between the Brosnan sound and what would become the default Craig sound. But Quantum of Solace, which was really, if you read the interviews at that time, David Arnold was sort of challenged by director Mark Forster to lean into a different kind of sound. It really reestablishes what the Bond sound is for Craig, and I want to give credit to David Arnold for paving the way for where Thomas Newman would go with Skyfall and Spectre. The sort of tighter sound, more focused on world music. I really love the Quantum of Solace score. I think it gets underrated because it doesn't have as many of the big melodies that people are drawn to in Bond music. And in general, the Craig era moves away from melody as a defining factor somewhere around Quantum of Solace. But cues like A Night at the Opera from Quantum of Solace are so perfectly Bondian. It's in many ways David Arnold paying homage to tracks like Capsule in Space from You Only Live Twice. This sort of hypnotic, sinewy sense of evil just sort of like working its way through the world is perfect to describe the quantum organization, and David Arnold captures that sound perfectly. Thomas Newman takes over from David Arnold, and both Thomas Newman and Hans Zimmer are faithful to the core idea of the David Arnold Bond sound. They both nod back to David Arnold's arrangement of the Bond theme. They both nod back to David Arnold's style in some ways. But Thomas Newman's style in Skyfall, and I think Skyfall is an exceptionally good score, it's just not a very melodic score, scales back the size of the orchestra, and it's a much tighter sound, and it's a much more focused sound. And it's less focused on melody than it is on instrumentation and percussion. And what I appreciate about how Thomas Newman focuses the Bond sound, again, is it gets back to a little bit of the jazz impulse of John Barry, but from a different facet. It's more focused on percussion. It's more focused on syncopated rhythm. And some things are lost there a little bit at different points. There's definitely a sense in which I think there are moments in Skyfall and Spectre, more so Spectre. I think Skyfall works really well with the Newman sound, but Spectre would really have benefited from, I think, some of the David Arnold grandeur that Newman isn't as comfortable bringing to the table. But there is a sort of driving energy that Newman picks up on that hasn't really been part of the Bond scores for quite a while, and I appreciate him coming kind of to the Bond sound from a different vantage point. It's more of a world music vantage point, lots of different instrumentation influences there. A track like Shanghai Drive is just effortlessly cool. You can't really say it's a John Barry style cue, but it captures a sort of the jazzy menace, I guess, of the Bond sound from like a very different vantage point. When Hans Zimmer comes in, he ends up kind of paying homage to both Newman and Arnold, and then also Barry. You know, he's quoting On Her Majesty's Secret Service, one of the greatest Bond scores, in No Time to Die. And it's kind of interesting to hear Hans Zimmer and his collaborators work together to create a Bond sound that's kind of uniting that whole era. I think what's really interesting is as you see the Bond sound evolve over time, it's clearly at a transitional point here before we go into the next phase, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not David Arnold returns to do the next Bond movie. He's clearly still involved with Eon Productions, you know, having done the theme for Road to a Million. It'll be interesting to see whether he comes back or whether they go with a different voice. But it's clear that the Bond sound is due for a slight tweak regardless of who is behind the baton, so to speak, because we're at this point where we've had a very clearly defined sound for classic Bond that John Barry kind of shepherded. We had a sound for the the Brosnan Bond, and now we kind of have this very more minimalistic, dark sound for the Craig era. So what is the sound of Bond in 2023? It's an interesting question. I have my own thoughts on the matter, but they're not relevant to this video. But hopefully you were able to track with my rambling. I love music a great deal. I think about music a great deal. I have no idea how this video will go over when I post it. So let me know in the comments if you found any of my musings here interesting. Otherwise, I'm sure I'll have something more interesting to say in the next video. So thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.